Hello, and welcome to the start of this monthly seminar series about starting to homeschool. I'm Pat Farenga. I'll be your host and presenter, here with my co-host and tech support, Steve Hargadon. I began work in 1981 at a place called Holt Associates. It was founded by the teacher and author John Holt in 1970. And in 1977, John founded a magazine called Growing Without Schooling. And that was the first publication about homeschooling and learning outside of school. John was very careful not to use the word homeschooling too much because he didn't want to give the idea that everything had to take place at home and that it had to look like school. The complete opposite is what John intended. And he created a word called unschooling to describe that. But that word didn't catch on any more than the word that even preceded homeschooling did, deschooling. There are all sorts of different words that and terminology about homeschooling that we'll discuss throughout the series. But for this very first one about why would you want to do it? Well, that's the first question that I had to deal with because I had just finished graduate school. I was going to be a teacher. I showed up in Boston in 1981. And as happens with these economic cycles, they were firing teachers. They weren't hiring them. So when I got to the Holt office as a volunteer, and John Holt asked me, what do you want to do with your life, Pat? Obviously, you don't want to just be packing books here in a book catalog. And I said, I'd like to be a teacher. And John got interested in that. And he said, why? I said, well, I like working with children, John. And John looked me deep in the eyes and said, Pat, you got it wrong. If you're going to be a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children. And that just completely disturbed me because I was a good student. I didn't particularly love school, but I didn't hate it. It was just boring. I could pass it and do the work, get my B+ or A, and get on with my life. It didn't. So I was kind of surprised that this guy had like the strong opinion that school was actually somehow working against my interests. Although I kind of felt that at different times as a student, I never verbalized it. And if I did, it was quickly shut down because that's the way it is. But now here's a man inviting me to examine all that again. And I resisted it. I pushed back. And finally he said, look, just read one of my books. I've written, at that point he had written not 8 of them. 8 of his 10 books have been published by then. And he was a 5th grade teacher. And so he had a lot of experience teaching. And he started off as a school reformer in the 1960s. And after being a very tough grader in exclusive private schools, and he changed his opinions over time. He started off from being this traditional hard grader in high-powered private schools to an open. He really became a supporter of open and democratic classrooms. Then he became a free schooler as a result of pushing for alternative schools and saying free schools. But then he finally realized as he watched each one of these movements falter and just like never really get traction to grow, he settled on homeschooling, or unschooling as he called it. So my journey is somewhat different, of course, because I didn't do as much teaching in the schools as John. But one of the things I've learned is that you want to take and use what you can from any of the ideas that I present or anybody else that's going to talk about homeschooling with you. Because, first of all, we all tend to teach the way we were taught. And so we have to break through that mold or learn how to refine it. Because we, too, as adults, we learn, too. And we get better at teaching and helping our children learn through the act of teaching and helping our children learn, just as they get better at learning through the act of trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't. Learning is a lifelong journey, not a destination. I'd like to share a screen slide with you for a minute. So a lot of teachers have used this phrase over the years, namely, learning is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. And that was something that I used to say and that I used to firmly believe in. But what I've learned is that the fire is in the child from the minute they are born. And those who want to support learning need to feed the fire, not relight it, not contain it, not extinguish it. You know, this next slide, let me see, again, if I could do it, that'd be great. Go to the next slide. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. This is what real learning looks like. You can't see and measure it. You can't do it even with standardized tests, because all you're measuring is what is studied for the test, which is so often quickly forgotten. I mean, let's think about this for a minute, because most of us, I hope that there's some second or third generation homeschoolers out there listening to this, but probably not. Most of us are people who went to school and are thinking about doing this for the first time. Now think about your school experiences. I mean, I was able to pass foreign languages and algebra and geometry, Latin, because I went to a prep school for high school. I don't speak Latin. I don't speak a foreign language. I don't remember geometry. I don't remember any of my algebra. You know, I mean, but we're through. And they say, oh, well, you're educated. And I say, I don't use it. And they say, well, that's because, you know, of the choices you made in your life. It's like it always comes back to us. It's like, well, why isn't the discipline, if I wanted to spend the time learning the piano instead of cramming for a calculus test that I would immediately forget the results for, why can't I do that? But guess what? That you can in a homeschool situation. You don't have to march children through a bunch of assumptions. The assumption that we all learn to speak a foreign language because it's just forced upon us in high school. We should be the most literate, multilingual country on earth because it's a mandatory requirement in every high school in America. But we are one of the most monolingual countries on earth. What is going on here? Real learning is not passing a test. Real learning is the learning that we go back to, that we build upon, that we reflect and refine. Learning isn't merely a right answer. John Holt liked to say, in fact, I think he even wrote this in his book, How Children Fail, his very first book, about his classroom experiences. And that is, the only difference between a good student and a bad student is that the good student is very careful not to forget what they studied for the test until after the test is over. It's the only difference. Now, if your children are doing well in school, if you like school, then don't worry about homeschooling. Homeschooling is an option for you if things aren't working. But if your children are happy or you're happy and they're just not happy there, you can find another school for them, another learning situation. And one of the great things about homeschooling is that it's creating more learning situations for children, far more than school. I mean, whether it's charter school or public school or even a lot of private schools, they're all pretty much the same. They just change the curricular recipes, but the structure is the same. The goals are the same, to get high test scores and college admissions so that they can brag that if you pay send your kid to our school, that'll happen to them too, even though we know that not everybody's going to succeed. Same thing with homeschooling. But the difference is in homeschooling, you can matriculate into another school, and and this happens all the time, and then go on. So you're going from one sort of learning situation to a completely different one, from homeschool to school. Whereas in school, you just tend to get shuttled from similar schools, but if you get lucky, you might get different styles of teachers or personalities. That could make a big difference. But the important thing to remember is homeschooling is not an irrevocable choice. Your children, and I'll use myself as an example. My wife and I homeschooled our 3 daughters, and our oldest daughter only spent 1 year in school. That was 6th grade. It was a very difficult year for her because she was really challenged by a bunch of girls who were on a gymnastics team to show that she was smart in math, which we didn't emphasize math in our homeschool, and so as a result, it became an issue. Oddly enough, and I'm going to talk about this in later seminars, when she did need to learn math, she learned all the math she needed in order to take college-level courses in 6 months. So when the will is there, there is a way, and that's an important lesson to learn, because we just think, oh, today's Tuesday, it's 10 o'clock, time to teach them math. There's a lot easier ways for this to happen when the student is motivated to learn math, and that may happen at 10 at night before they go to bed. in which case you might have a great conversation about a math concept with them or something. That's the advantage of homeschooling. You can let the learners in control, and you're learning all the time. You're not making these artificial dotted lines that separate science from math, from geometry, from history and art. I mean, you can blend it all, just as a child does anyway, or we do it after we leave school. We like to have many different interests that play into our abilities. Another reason people believe that homeschooling is a good option for them is that they feel that raising their children is their business and not the government's. If their children want to benefit from more science than art or more music than math, they can do so without having to ask permission, not only from the school principal and then the district and then maybe even the state school board, because you want to do something that's off the curriculum. Just a little side note, that's one of the reasons John Holt got fired from just about every private school he taught at, was because he was using non-curricular materials and he would veer off the curriculum to address students or classroom needs at that time. That was, he writes about this in his book Instead of Education, and also in How Children Fail and How Children Learn in parts. And today, a lot of teachers leave the profession because they feel they're micromanaged and that they can't really work with students because all they're doing is administering the will of the state and then the will of the federal government to get more test scores, which will somehow help children in the future, because it's not clear to me that they've been using those test scores to help the kids right now, but that's yet another issue. The thing to remember is that if your children want to play, if your children want to read, you can let them do that all day or all week. It doesn't have to be this curricular idea that we have a little gas tank in the brain and it has a meter on it, and we're going to put knowledge in there and see how that gas meter, how much of that gas took in there, and I mean, learning just doesn't work that way, even though we wish it would, because it would make the school machinery work. But let's look at that for a minute. School is a historical artifact created out of the industrial age, and like so many institutions of that time, it is founded upon the 19th century factory model of education. And this was considered an outdated model for learning well before the current criticisms of schooling came from the technology industry. For instance, you've got Jacques Ellul in the 50s, the Technological Society, Illich and Holt and Paul Goodman, and many of the E.F. Schumacher, a lot of writers talking about small is beautiful. Let's not turn it into this big data sort of world. Let's figure out ways to keep things small and have lots of different communities that interact. And then you even further back, Professor A.A. Burley at Tufts University wrote a book called The School in the Home in 1910. And why? Because he said he had letters by the hundreds from bricklayers to professors complaining about the quality of public schools. Public schools had only been around about 60 or 70 years then. They got started in Massachusetts in 1850. And then in I think it was 1921, there's a book called The Mother's Letters to a Schoolmaster about a mom who's homeschooling her son in Midtown Manhattan. And her reasons are very pertinent to democratic schools, I think, in particular. One of the reasons, the schoolmaster writes her in a letter saying, how's your son going to learn about democracy if he doesn't go to school? And this is one of these great ideas that was added on to school, by the way, much later. I mean, the original purpose by Horace Mann and the Boston School Committee was to teach children how to read the Bible. This idea of becoming a good citizen and a self-motivated person, that was all added on. I mean, school is very much a Frankenstein machine that different things getting added and pulled away from it over time, and there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with it over time. But what Rita Sherman, in her letter to a schoolmaster, wrote, saying, when he said, "How's your child going to learn about democracy if he doesn't go to school?" Her reply was, "How can you learn democracy in a place where it isn't practiced?" And that, to me, gets to the core of learning by doing versus learning by listening. And, this whole idea of obedience to authority, this ingrained idea that we won't do anything until someone in authority tells us what to do. That kind of runs antithetical to the Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, the whole notion of our founding fathers of America as a place of self-determination. And school has sort of gotten in the way of that in some odd ways. And I don't think it was deliberate. It just happened as different opportunities arose and different things happened. But now it's really hard to find a meaningful different option unless you consider, say, homeschooling, or you have the money to afford a private school. But homeschooling doesn't need to cost a lot of money, and that's what I want to get to in the next slide. You can reproduce conventional school in your home, and I'm going to show you how, because a lot of homeschoolers do it. In fact, many homeschoolers get started that way. And then they eventually move into other things, which is, probably, we're going to discuss a lot of that. But the idea is to trust yourself and your children to rediscover your self-motivations for learning. You're not learning just to get a grade. You're not learning just because so-and-so said you have to, or because I'm 10, I've got to do this. You're learning because you have a passion for, I want to learn about ants if you're a little kid, or cars if you were a teenager, or how colors mix if you're 1 or 2 years old. These are all self-motivations, and you as a parent can help them. And when you get out of your field, you find help. And we're going to talk about that in length in another seminar. North Star Learning Center in South Hadley, Massachusetts, has a wonderful motto that they use on their materials. Learning is natural. School is optional. Can we get the next slide up, Steve? The travel one? I think it's the one after that. No? Maybe before it then. It's got the books about travel on it. Yeah, there you go. All right. So one of the things that that homeschooling allows you to do is get off the whole schedule of school. So that means you could travel when school's in session. I know some parents who went to Disneyland and popular destinations for February and other school vacations love homeschooling because they could take advantage of all these places on the non-school vacation times, save a lot of money. But let me talk about traveling first locally, starting small. A lot of homeschoolers find, that a great way to involve their children and themselves is to start with their local history. What's going on in our neighborhood? Where do we come from? And most cities have a historical society that you can visit and check this out. Or you could go to if you're like us in Medford, Massachusetts, where I live, we have a bunch of graveyards that are quite old. And so you could go in there and see these old tombstones and read them, and then go to the local library and start to look up some of these people. And eventually, you will be put in touch with people who are local historians who know this. And this really brings history to life because it's the history of right around you, right here. And it's also a great way to socialize and meet other people in your neighborhood, as well as to appreciate your neighborhood. Then you expand it. You get in the car and you start to drive out into your region. I remember one time I was working with a young homeschool boy, and he was really interested in how the USS Constitution was built because it's here in right here in Boston. So we went. The Saugus Iron Works didn't supply any of the metal, I don't think, to USS Constitution, but the Saugus Iron Works is a national park, and I'd never been to it when I was raising my own girls. None of them had an interest in this, but what's interesting about the Saugus Iron Works is this is where they made all the metal for the boats and for the machinery and stuff at the turn of the century. And they have a bellows, that is literally the size of a house. And it's in this huge house, and it keeps this huge fire going, and you can see, it's built next to a waterfall. I mean, it's an incredible structure, and it really, brought to life not only history, but the whole science and engineering of how these machines work to create metal. And that's just region. That's just like driving around. And then the next step, of course, is what you're looking at here on the screen, which is, well, what about adventuring with children? What about going to other states? And homeschoolers online, there's a lot of this. Before the online world, my magazine, Growing Without Schooling, had a directory. and it just listed the first names and birth years of the children in each family that wanted to be listed. And then you would look around, like if you wanted to go visit Montana, and let's say you live here in Boston, you would look up in the directory who lives in Montana. It's got kids roughly my age, and then you write them a letter. There was no internet then, and go ahead and hook up with them, and they would either put you up or tell you where to go and stuff. And homeschools do a lot of can do a lot of low-cost travel. And of course, for some, depending on your religion, if you're Mormon and other mission, places, religions that use missions, or in fact missionary families. When I first started working at Holt Associates in 1981, there are a fair number of missionaries from around the world that subscribe to our magazine. And in fact, one of the largest curriculum providers, Calvert, down in Baltimore, they sold to diplomats' children and families, and to missionaries who were stationed abroad. And Calvert was one of the earliest suppliers of standardized curriculum to homeschoolers. But it wasn't called homeschooling then; it was just called people traveling abroad, missions and stuff. So there are two books on here that I want to call special attention to: Kids for Sale and 360 Degrees Longitude, because there is this whole subgenre of travel in homeschooling about sailing around the world. In fact, without much difficulty, you can Google homeschool teens who sailed around the world on their own. But Kids for Sale and 360 Degrees Longitude are about families that just sort of pack up and say, we're going for around the world or down in the Bahamas for 6 months. Kids for Sale, the family actually lives on the boat. This is their lifestyle. That to me is a fascinating book. 360 Degrees Longitude, the guy and his family, they're wealthy, they're high-tech people. They take a year off, they travel, and they stay in touch with all the curriculum stuff through the internet and blah, blah, blah. So there are two different ways of doing it. You could do it with money, you could do it with little money. In fact, one of my favorite books about this is called Educational Travel on a Shoestring, written by two homeschool moms. It's a wonderful way to bring your family together, or if you have older children, to encourage them to move out on their own and to experience some travel. We're very lucky we were able to do this with our children, And then finally, the new global student. This woman, Maya Frost, talks about her children and other kids that were not homeschooled, by the way, but she sees the value in homeschooling. But they just didn't see the value in college. Just like I'm saying, a lot of people throw up their arms and say, okay, what's the big deal about school right now? I mean, other than it puts a lot of pressure on us to get skills for jobs that don't exist anymore, it seems. The new global student, saying skip the SAT, save thousands of dollars, and get a truly international education. Mark Twain said, travel broadens one, and that really is the case. Laney, on the handout, I've listed a couple of resources for this. Laney Liberty and Blake Bowles both offer travel opportunities for homeschoolers and unschoolers. Steve, yes?
So we'll let people know the handout is on the website, on the recordings page. So if you go to the recordings page, you can download the handout that Pat's referencing.
Thank you, Steve. And can we move to the next slide now? Another reason that parents homeschool is because they enjoy being with their children, watching and helping them learn, and they don't want to give that pleasure up to others. I mean, this is not a common thing. When you watch television, when you read books, almost everyone is about, oh, how annoying these kids are, and when am I going to get some quiet? But we know that not every family has to be that way, that actually you can live joyfully, peacefully, and happily with your children. And for families that have found that sweet spot, and it can come and go, let's face it, but more often than not, why should they give that pleasure up? They enjoy it, and as I said, if you can't, you're certainly capable of teaching your kids most of the pre-K, I would even say elementary school curriculum, and then if not, there's plenty of books and resources and tutors and graduate students and all sorts of internet help and Khan Academy. There's so much out there that you can point your child to. You you really have the opportunity, because of technology right now, to be the guide on the side instead of the sage on the stage. That's an old teacher's phrase that John Holt taught me, and that was echoed in every teacher I've heard who talks about graduate school or teacher school, but very few people follow it. And teacher, again, I'm not attacking teachers. They're under a lot of pressure to be the sage on the stage and to make those kids perform. It's gotten to the point now where their salaries, health benefits, everything is on how kids' performance. And that's not going to make them enjoy kids too much either, right? So this is not a very healthy situation all around. But we get the flack back that if you are a happy family, then maybe you're too attached. Well, I don't know how you judge who is too attached unless it's really pretty extreme behavior. For me, attachment parenting and homeschooling go hand in hand. And building your home life, building your family connections and relationships are important. They just don't happen. A lot of people assume they happen, or assume that because I'm sending you to a certain type of school, that they will make that happen for us. No, it's got to be you. You've got to work at it. And you can build a home life. Homeschooling isn't for everyone. When parents say, I can't homeschool because I go crazy being with my kids that much time, remember, homeschooling is not for everyone. But you'd be surprised how homeschooling can bring you and your children together if you'll get rid of the social pressure of being different. I think it's the being different that wears out parents far more than it does children. There's a new book out. It came out just in September of 2014, I guess. Ben Hewitt's book, Homegrown. And his children couldn't be more out of sync with modern society. They live in rural Vermont in a homestead, and both his boys are now in the young preteens or young teens. They're trappers. They love to be outdoors, and they know more about nature than any of us probably do. And a lot of the book is Ben and his wife struggling with this, and eventually they just say, so what? Look how deep their knowledge is. Look how comfortable they are talking with people of different ages about their adventures in the woods and sharing these adventures. I strongly recommend Homegrown if you're worried about your children being out of sync. If you can let go of school pressure to make your children perform certain things at certain times, you get the time to deepen your relationships with your children. The more freely you and your children communicate, the easier it's going to be for your children to show and tell you how and what they want to learn. I mean, that's what it is. No book is going to tell you. A book may tell you what to do after you've discovered what they want to learn, but what is it that they want to learn? What are they really interested in? That's what you got to work with them, talk with them, and figure this out. The next slide is about the parents whose reason for homeschooling is that they don't want children to be hurt. They don't want their children to be hurt spiritually, physically, or mentally in school. Again, school can be a great experience for some, but for many it's a time where bullies, nonstop academic pressure and testing, and various challenges and concerns about a child's beliefs, family background, and social status actually undermine learning in school. Because let's face it, learning is state-dependent. If you are in an anxious or fearful state, you're just not going to be receptive to learning or doing things that people are asking you to do. Now, we need to honor this in our children as we do in our adult friends at work in our community. We know if our friend at work is having a tough day, we say, oh, take a break, go for a walk. When do we do that in school? We just tell them to suck it up and continue studies. Further, particularly for smart and compliant students, such as those that John Holt wrote about in How Children Fail, the crushing boredom of school serves as pre-alienation for them to be prepared for their future jobs as lawyers and quants or whatnot. Homeschooling can accommodate fast and slow learning and all sorts of side roads that learning can take us down. Whereas school is a machine that runs on a tight schedule, and those within it can't keep up with the school schedule are considered defective. There's some fears that if you homeschool, your child won't be able to get back in school. That's completely unfounded. So homeschoolers have no problem going back into school, and particularly at the grade that they normally should be. Also, getting into college, there's been many studies, and I'm going to talk about that in another seminar about college admissions. But just to say it up front, homeschoolers get into college without any difficulty, and there's plenty of colleges that are looking for homeschoolers, or that are actually being created just for homeschoolers. And most importantly, if you didn't want to go to elementary school or high school and you got a good good education, why would you want to go to college? There's all sorts of options for college. We're going to talk about them. Uncollege, indicated one of them here, travel. But there's hacker school. There's a lot of new things coming out that we'll talk about. So can we go to the next slide, please? So when I first worked at Growing Without Schooling, it was 1981, and John Holt had just gotten the book Teach Your Own published. And I tried to read it. It was the first book of his I tried to read, and I couldn't get into it. I kept saying to myself, how is anyone, because I just kept thinking it was like school. So how's anyone going to do all that stuff that was done to me in school in their home? That's crazy. And back then in 1981, John said there were maybe 20 to 25,000 homeschooled students in America. Well, no one studied it until about 1999. I mean, there were private researchers. Brian Ray kept some numbers and stuff. But the official numbers came from the federal government first in 1999. And as you can see in the slide, it has grown from less than 1 million in 1999 to easily over 2 million in just 15 years. That's a lot of growth. I mean, we're still quite small. I mean, look, there's 64 million public school students in the United States of America, I believe. So this is, we're still a drop in the bucket, but it's growing. It's a counter trend that gives me a lot of hope that we may be able to personalize, individualize, and create real meaningful communities of support for one another. And I keep emphasizing how ordinary parents can homeschool well. And it's important to remember that, which is why these numbers keep growing. You don't have to be a certified teacher in any state in America in order to teach your child. And homeschoolers have had great success. In fact, some of homeschooling's leading lights, Ivan Illich, John Holt, John Gatto, Dr. Raymond Moore, and most recently Dr. Peter Gray, are noted school teachers, authors, and university professors. Dr. Moore was also an education researcher for the U.S. government, and Dr. Gray was chairman of the psychology department at Boston College. All actively support homeschooling for educational reasons, and I'm going to talk more about that in another seminar. But the point for studying them now is one of the major reasons people turn to homeschooling is because, like these teachers and professors, they see the majority of conventional school techniques for teaching and learning as numbingly boring and unrelated to the concerns and needs of children. These scholars all have research studies, historical case studies, and test scores to support their positions that children can and do learn vitally important things through social activity, personal reflection, and group and solitary play without attending schools as we know them. However, doing this means that we have to think of education as a lifelong pursuit rather than a degree to earn for employment. And this disrupts a lot of institutions and businesses who depend on the education economy to remain stable in terms of their consumer pipeline, the length of compulsory schools. Is it any surprise that the school year keeps getting longer? And limiting the options for where children can be during the day. There actually are attempts to curfew children who are out during school hours. Fortunately, homeschoolers have been fighting back on that, but it's an issue. In fact, everything I just talked about, all these activities were once widely supported in our communities. Just look at old movies, and you can see how children were present on the streets, the parks, the playgrounds of our communities in ways that they are not now. Right now, they're tightly controlled in school if they're allowed to have any activities at all. And let's face it, recess has vanished from many schools in favor of, quote, learning time. One of my favorite stories and books about this is David Guterson's Family Matters. David wrote the book while he was a high school English teacher and a homeschooler of his own children. His experiences as a teacher versus his experiences as a parent led him to homeschool his own children. So what I thought was interesting about these numbers, and I'm going to wrap up now, is that if you ask the National Center for Home Education Statistics why people homeschool, it's pretty much similar to the reasons I've been saying. The top reasons given in 2012 were concern about the environment of other schools, 91%, a desire to provide moral instruction, 77%, and dissatisfaction with academic instruction at other schools, 74%. We move to the next slide, please, Steve. So what does this look like if you're not doing school at home? I just wanted to give you a quick, there's a 2-minute, 40-second video to give you an idea of what a grown homeschooler reflecting on her life can share with us, and to show you that this idea about learning without a curriculum can indeed work. Can you play the video, or is that something I need to do?
No, I'll play the video, and it will come through my system. While people are watching the video, I also want them to know if they look toward the top of their screen where their name is on the Google Hangout, there's a grid, and if you click that grid, it will give you the ability to go to the Q&A functionality. So if you want to be ready to start asking questions for Pat, you can click on that grid, go to the Q&A functionality. Okay, here goes the video.
What I do here at MediaSite is I'm the product management team, and basically it's the technical and business side of marketing. So we go out and talk to customers and prospective customers and find out what it is that they're interested in. When I was writing Real Lives, Real Lives is a book about 11 teenagers who don't go to school, and there's 11 of us who wrote essays talking about what it is that we did as teenagers who didn't go to school. Actually, I've got to show you. This is me and my horse Nick, and this is a photo that my mother actually took of us jumping. So my essay in here, this is where I got to use my example of what it is that homeschoolers can do, because my essay was called My Favorite Teacher's a Horse. And I talked about all the stuff that I could do with horses to actually cover all of the academic subjects that you would be covering in a typical school environment. When I was writing Real Lives, I was working part-time in a horseback riding stable. So I got experience in an office environment and a work environment, learned to work with a lot of different people. And then also with a lot of the 4-H stuff that I was involved in, I did a lot of publicity for the 4-H clubs. That was kind of a natural progression into my first job doing public relations. And then from there, it was just a progression into more the business end of things and the marketing.
She was working at Sony USA, and we didn't have a position from what I understand, so the person that was our team lead created a position for Erin because of the high energy and the intelligence that she saw with Erin. Because of her experience, even though she's relatively young in a product management role, she has a great deal of intellect and ability to do the job and move us forward as a company.
I still really don't know what I want to do when I grow up. If you asked me 9 years ago, I think I would have told you I wanted to be a lawyer. If you asked me about 4 years ago, I would have told you I wanted to do political campaign management. 2 years ago, I would have said I wanted to do public relations. Now I'm much more interested in marketing and technical, computer software type things and the business end of stuff. So things have changed a lot over the last 9 years since I wrote my chapter in Real Lives. One of the things I think is that I don't feel like I have to decide what I want to do. I know that I have the skills to do a lot of different things, so I don't feel any real pressure to say, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. This is absolutely my final career path here. So, I really can't tell you what I'm going to do for sure 9 years from now, because I have no plans to ever grow up completely.
That's a segment from a documentary made by homeschooler Pete Kowalski. On the handout, you'll find the reference to his website. You can see the whole movie there as well. It's called Grown Without Schooling. Can we move on to the last slide now. Probably another reason why parents decide to homeschool is that they feel squeezed by time, by the intensified scheduling and obligations of school and work, and homeschooling can provide a solution that centers the family during stressful times. Ben Hewitt, in that book Homegrown, writes, "Yet the physical and cognitive implications of classroom learning have played minor roles in our decision to unschool Finn and Rye." Those are his children's names, his boys' names. "It's not that I don't want them to be healthy or smart. Of course I do. I'm their father. But in truth, what I most want for my boys can't be charted or graphed. It can't be measured, at least not by common metrics. There is no standardized test that will tell me if it has been achieved, and there is no specific curriculum that will lead to its realization. This is what I want for my sons. Freedom. Not just physical freedom, but intellectual and emotional freedom from the formulaic learning that prevails in our schools. I want for them the freedom to immerse themselves in the fields and forests that surround our home, to wander aimlessly or with purpose. I want for them the freedom to develop at whatever pace is etched in their DNA, not the pace dictated by an institution looking to meet the benchmarks that will in part determine its funding. I want them to be free to love learning for its own sake, the way that all children love learning for its own sake, when it's not forced on them or attached to a reward. I want them to remain free of social pressures to look, act, or think any way but that which feels most natural to them. I want for them the freedom to be children, and no one can teach them how to do that. There's also no one to teach you. Well, those were Ben's words. These are my words now. There's also no one to teach you about how to make homeschooling work. I've helped many families start and continue to homeschool and unschool successfully, but they're all different, and I can never reduce all these individual solutions into a generalized curricula. Some homeschoolers make school at home work for them because they're comfortable with that structure. For others, school at home is a starting point, and they gradually move away from doing school at home and follow the interests and passions of their children as they grow and learn together. And then for others, their own or their children's experiences with school were so negative or boring that they wholeheartedly and immediately embrace unschooling as their solution. I want you to feel the freedom to be a parent who sees the potential in their children to be a sailor, to be a doctor, to be a musician, not in the future, right now. Right now, in whatever way you can, help your children move towards their goals, no matter how fleeting they are. They may want to be a musician today, and then an actor or a policeman tomorrow, or nothing. They just want to be a child. But I want you to have the freedom to ditch the school curriculum. Gosh, now there's articles in Education Week about how preschoolers, 2-, 3-year-olds, are feeling pressure to read and calculate in preschool situations. This is crazy. I want you to feel the freedom to ditch the school curriculum and build your own educations, ones that integrate your family schedule with your children's learning. I want you to feel the freedom to learn from your interactions with your children and from your observations and love of your children. In doing so, your children will show you how to best help them. Trust yourself. Recalibrate when things stop working, and enjoy your time with your children. You may only homeschool for a few months, a year, or for all their school years. The choice is yours, and you can change your mind again and again. For instance, one of our daughters went in and out of elementary school many times during 1st through 5th grade, sometimes just 3 weeks, in and out. That is it, until she decided that home was a better place for her to be. Don't let anyone railroad you into homeschooling for any reason. Homeschooling works best when it's done out of a joy for living, not a duty to a cause. Homeschooling is self-selecting and self-correcting, and compulsion easily undermines both those. You're only going to get this time together once, so make the most of it. Don't worry about being a great teacher to your children. You can and will and have and hire many tutors and teachers and friends and mentors and interns and apprentice situations for your child, but there's only one of you to be, well, two of you hopefully, but there's only going to be you as their parents. Don't sacrifice your relationship as a parent with your child on the altar of education. It's not worth it. Your child will learn more by having a good relationship with you than by having you constantly badger them about their lack of education or doing more. You're only going to get this time to be with your children now, once. Make the most of it. And if school happens to be important to that, great. If not, don't worry about it, because you're going to learn important things nonetheless. So I'd like to open it up to questions now. We went about 15 minutes over, but we've had some technical glitches we had to learn about. So, go ahead. I'd like to get some questions.
Let me give some quick instructions here. So if you're in the YouTube channel, you're not able to see or use the Q&A function. But if you're in the Google Hangout, which was the first link that we sent everyone, you may be seeing a showcase set on the right-hand side of your screen. And to get that to turn into the Q&A functionality, you're looking for a grid, a little square. It looks like a Rubik's Cube, side of a Rubik's Cube. It's at the top of your screen, and you click on that, and it lets you switch over to the Q&A functionality. And Pat, you can click on, as a broadcaster, you can click on the Q&A to the left of your screen, and it will bring up any questions that come up. Now we know that we're about a minute ahead of our viewing audience, and so we'll wait a minute here to see if there are questions that come up. Pat, I could tell that you felt there were moments when there was some strong emotion, where you were trying to communicate support for people who are making independent decisions. Is that something you find people need when they are thinking about homeschooling?
Absolutely. Most people will tell you you're crazy. So I feel it's really important for them to know not only are they not crazy, but this is a great idea. It can actually work very well.
I also loved that book you referenced. I'm trying to remember the name. Is it the guy who was the school teacher and
Family Matters?
Family Matters. And he's the author of another famous book, right?
Yeah, David Guterson is his name, and he wrote a couple of essays in Harper's, and then Family Matters got turned into a book. But then he turns out he's a superb novelist, and he wrote the book Snow Falling on Cedars, which was a bestseller and an Academy Award-winning movie.
Did he ever write more on homeschooling?
Nothing that I know of. I do know that after Family Matters came out, and it was a success, he and his wife opened a homeschool resource center on the, I think they lived on an island in the Puget Sound, and it didn't go too well, and they just moved into some other things, and he became a novelist. But there was definitely an effort by them to get even more deeply involved in homeschooling after the book came out.
Pat, we have a question come in, but before we do, we respond to that.
Yes.
People can go to your website, right? And there is a bookstore there of books available. Do you want to give that link out?
Well, it's what it is it's a list of books that we used to sell at Holt Associates, from 1981 until 2001. It's called John Holt's Reading List. I don't remember the URL off the top of my head, but if you go to my website, just choose, look under John Holt, and you'll see the reading list. In fact, it's on the homepage. I've got it called out there.
And you can get to your website by going to the About Pat on the Starting to Homeschool site.
Right. It's www.johnholtgws.com.
John Holt GWS, which stands for Growing Without Schooling.
Yes.
Okay, so Lainey Liberty asks, what resources do you recommend to homeschoolers to deal with state education laws?
Well, it all depends on what the issues are, because very often the best resource is to gather your local homeschoolers and find out what is going on at the State House. But create a committee and get some people who will go and talk to these legislators and find out what's going on. Why do they need these laws? Because 90% of the time, when these guys meet with homeschooling parents, it's the first time they're seeing a homeschooling parent. They've been told, like, by public school people, by other politicians, and oh, these homeschoolers, they don't know what they're doing. They're just a bunch of, yahoos who think that their kids are great. We got to corral them and do something about them. And again, it's there's no evidence, or they're generalizing from one bad situation, and this happens periodically. But the reality is, homeschoolers have successfully been able to beat back, onerous regulations. Sometimes we've had to fight, like Homeschool Legal Defense Association, as happens in Wisconsin. I mean, sometimes homeschoolers are divided on whether or not you have you've got a good law or not, and fight. So, the best thing is to find, your support with other homeschoolers and get the facts from the source. Don't talk to the politicians who are promoting the bill or against it. I mean, other than to gather information, but get the bill itself. Sit there and talk amongst yourselves. You can do this. You don't need to hire a lawyer. I mean, the whole point of America, I mean, lawyers and politicians have obfuscated, as educators have obfuscated things like reading instruction. So, we've made them so complicated. But the point is, citizens in America are supposed to be able to operate, the levers of their government. And we, believe it or not, they still exist. And one of those levers is for you to go to the State House and say, I'm a homeschooler and this law impacts me and I want to know why you're doing it, why you support it, or would you help me change it and whatnot. And that does it.
Pat, does the Homeschool Legal Defense Association keep sort of a state-by-state synopsis of what the regulations are?
They do, and it's good as far as it goes, but you have to realize that they've got their little axes to grind. For instance, here in Massachusetts, I've been homeschooling since 1986, when my first child was born. I've been living here since 1981, and they've been saying that HSLDA claims that we're one of the worst, most regulated states to homeschool in because we have to deal with our local school officials. We like that situation. We like dealing with our local school officials. And, homeschooling is growing, and we don't have too many problems in Massachusetts. It's a lot easier for lawyers to deal with other lawyers in the State House. And so that's their particular point of view here. But we live here, and even the homeschoolers that support HSLDA in Massachusetts may disagree with them there because they've never been able to get critical mass in Massachusetts to say we need a new law. We in Massachusetts have no law about homeschooling, and we like it that way. We have the right, and that's all we need. And then we prove that we're working with our children. See, that's the thing that bothers them is we have to send in written narratives once a year or some sort of evidence that our children are being educated. We don't have a problem with that. But so you got to take everything with a grain of salt. On the other hand, they've done a lot of good for other people in other states where they've had some really bad situations. So that's why it's more important for you to do it, you the individual, to get the facts and to form a bond with other people to help you find those facts. Otherwise, we just keep relying on the great white man on the horse to save us all the time. And I'm tired of that. I've not seen that work too well in the last 40 years, but I have seen crowdsourcing, citizen action, people getting together. Not any individual one of us is an expert and has the right answer, but if enough of us get together, we'll be right about 85% of the time, which I guess is about as good as school can get. So I see there's another question.
Delmy asks, we're considering doing a chartered school that is mostly homeschooling. We're new to both homeschooling and unschooling. Would you recommend that we try the charter school or avoid anything that has any sort of requirements?
I'm not sure what the charter school laws are in your state. I know here in Massachusetts, if you want to do a charter school, you got to meet all the requirements of public schools, and that includes testing. So if you want to go down there, but you're not going to be able to let your 6 to 8 year old learn Japanese as we did, because it's just not taught at those ages and stuff, and they may say that your charter school can't do that. I understand that some states are better with charters than others, so I guess a lot does depend on that. But I do think that whatever support, I think that you might have more luck, Delmy, going with a learning center sort of approach than trying to be a charter school. Because charter schools also get state funding, and you're going to be subject to those strings and so on. So I do know that there's a lot more people doing learning centers and just starting private businesses, tutoring and placement services for internships and apprenticeships for homeschoolers, creating opportunities, than charter schools. In fact, in California and in Oregon, I think there's a couple of charter schools that work with homeschoolers. And in the movie Class Dismissed, it was a great example. It just occurred to me. In the movie, which just came out this year, it's a very current. The mom and her children decide that homeschooling, they get nervous, they lose their courage, so they say, we're going to enroll in a charter school homeschool program. And every book that they ditched at the beginning of the movie from the public school because the kids couldn't stand that work came back in the home because the charter school said, this is what you got to do. You're going to homeschool through us. And they wound up ditching the charter school in the movie, too, and just going back to homeschooling. So I don't know. I don't know enough about the laws in your state, tell me, but I would lean more towards a learning center if I were you.
Pat, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you. Do you want to give a quick preview of the next month's webinar?
Yes. Well, let me just make sure I got the right the right thing. Next month we're going to do getting started with homeschooling, the elementary school years. That's where I'm going to talk about how do I apply for homeschooling? How do I find out the rules in my state? Because you don't have to apply in every state. There are 11 states where you don't have to do anything other than homeschool your child. And then there are other states like New York, quarterly evaluations and stuff, and other states like Massachusetts once a year. So we're going to talk about that, how to find those states, and then how to meet and report them if you have to, and give you a lot of different options and resources, starting with that. Although it's actually then that's going to be the third seminar. We're talking about resources and what to do once you're home. Really, I'm going to spend a lot of time just talking about like how to set yourself up so you're legal, so that your philosophy is in place and you're comfortable to start homeschooling your child. And then we're going to get down into the weeds about what do we do now that we're learning at home in April. So March is how do we get started? How do we get the state satisfied and deal with school officials and relatives who think we're nuts for homeschooling?
Terrific. Okay, we'll post this video later today. And if you've signed up on the website, you'll receive notice of the future webinars. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks for everyone for coming and attending.